In the season of life which I passed through the rain's hand, more than 90 duels did I face to prove myself invincible. I learned the 38 grips, the 750 offensive and 1800 defensive stances, and the 9,000 strikes that I would practice for all my future days. With Onsi's blessing, the sword singer must do the same to achieve mastery of discipline. In the season of life in which I marched beneath the sun's height, before the power of the gods did I kneel. I dedicated myself wholly unto the spirit of the sword, to forge my Shihai, which I would wield for all my future days. With Tall Papa's blessing, the sword singer must do the same to achieve mastery of devotion. In the season of life in which I was exposed to the hearth's fire, into deep contemplation did I withdraw to ponder the nature of truth. I sharpened my mind as my blade, and defined the principles I would honour for all my future days. With Tava's blessing, the sword singer must do the same to achieve mastery of wisdom. In the season of life in which I shivered from the frost's fall, so did I find myself called upon to cast aside the notions of my destiny that I had deemed true. I left the land of my home to which I did not return for all my future days. Under Satakarl's ever-changing influence, the sword singer must do the same to achieve mastery of sacrifice. Frandar do Hunding, Hel Ansai no Shira, or simply Frandar Hunding, is a name that carries as much weight as the anvil upon which his many blades were forged. His teachings are at the molten core of Redguard culture. Every home has an alcove built for the sole purpose of housing a copy of Hunding's Book of Circles. We can learn much about this fascinating, unique race by reading from its pages. Without a doubt, the Redguards are a warrior people. The strengths and virtues of the swordsman are etched deeply into their sense of identity. Discipline, devotion, wisdom and sacrifice are their lifeblood, giving life to the Redguard, who is shaped by their long and decorated history. This race may have existed on Tamriel as early as the 8th century of the First Era, but they maintain their distinct identity, and beyond being human, share little in common with their neighbours. To perceive the Redguards as little more than a horde of barbaric warriors, noteworthy only for their flowing fabrics and curved swords, would be a great disservice. To do this would be to neglect the mastery of wisdom. Redguards, and Yokudans before them, may use weaponry in battle as a metaphor for many aspects of life and culture, but actually drawing the blade is not an action done flippantly. Hey guys, it's Drew here and welcome back to FudgeMuppet. Both Scott and I have come to appreciate the Redguards more after delving into their rich and intriguing lore in previous videos. I don't think I've ever heard an Elder Scrolls fan rate the Redguards in the top 5 of their preferred races, and I think that's a shame. By the end of this video, I hope to see the Redguards get some more love in the community. In all our complete guides so far, I've started at the very beginning, with the various creation stories for the mortal realm, and the Redguards have their own unique understanding of how they came into being. It all begins with Satakarl, the world's skin, the serpent god of everything. To deny that the world must end is to deny that it began. Satakarl is the making and the unmaking, the birth and the death, love and fear. For the world is the egg that Satakarl laid, and the egg that in time Satakarl shall eat. To know Satakarl, consider a river. As a snake sheds its skin and lives on, so a river sheds its water into the sea, yet is reborn at the source. To be the world skin is to be everything, and to be everything is to be nothing. If you're familiar with the creation stories, you'll know that almost all of them involve the primordial forces of stasis and change, some variation of Anu and Padamai, one omnipotent entity that encompasses everything, and another that embodies chaos, which interplays with the constancy of the first. The Akutan creation story is no different. Instead of Anu, the blinding ineffable light, you have Satak the snake, and instead of Padamai, the Stygian void, you have Akel, Satak's ravenous stomach. Satak was the first serpent, the snake who came before, and all the worlds to come rested in the glimmer of its scales. But Satak was so big that there was nothing but it, and thus it was coiled around and around itself. And the worlds to come slid across each other, but none had room to breathe or even be. And so the worlds called to something to save them, to let them out. But of course, there was nothing outside the first serpent, so aid had to come from inside. This was Akel, the hungry stomach. As Satak frivolously endeavored to satiate his endless cravings, he swallowed everything around him, and as a result, space was created for the world scales to shed themselves from Satak and exist independently. It was a tumultuous time in prehistory, as Satak was not particular about what he consumed, and many of these worlds were eaten before they had time to properly materialize. This creation story comes from the monomyth, but it also aligns with the parallel story told by the annotated Annuad. In the Annuad, the conflict between the brothers Anu and Padamai led to 11 of the 12 worlds of creation being destroyed. In the end, only one, the mortal world, endured. The Yokudan creation myth manifests in a different metaphor, but the connection is clear. The first serpent battled with his insatiable hunger like Anu warred with his sibling Padamai, and the result of their contest was the mortal realm. In other stories, Anu's self-reflection led to the creation of the Aedra, the souls of his soul. In the story of the world skin, the gods come about in a slightly different way. Pretty soon Akel caused Satak to bite its own heart, and that was the end. The hunger, though, refused to stop, even in death, and so the first serpent shed its skin to begin anew. As the old world died, Satakal began, and when things realized this pattern, so did they realize what their part in it was. They began to take names, like Ruptga or Tuwaka, and they strode about looking for their kin. The creation story also gives an explanation for why the gods of the Yokudans survive the endings of the cycle. It also introduces the Yokudan afterlife. As Satakal ate itself over and over again, the strongest spirits learned to bypass the cycle by moving at strange angles. They called this process the walkabout, a way of striding between the world skins. Ruptga was so big that he was able to place the stars in the sky so that weaker spirits might find their way easier. This practice became so easy for the spirits that it became a place, called the Far Shores, a time of waiting until the next skin. Ruptga, or Tulpapa, as he became known to mortals, sired many children over the course of the infinite cycles. He also created himself a friend and helper from the detritus of Satakal's past skins. This creation was called Sep, the second serpent, the Yokudan equivalent to Lorcan. Sep, using his creation as inspiration, gathered the rest of the old skins and balled them up. He then tricked many of the spirits who existed outside of Satakal's cycle into thinking that if they give life to these old skin balls, they could create their own world, without needing to worry about survival every time Satakal ate himself. The spirits on the skin ball started to die because they were very far from the real world of Satakal, and they found that it was too far to jump into the Far Shores now. The spirits that were left pleaded with Tulpapa to take them back, but grim Ruptga would not, and he told the spirits that they must learn new ways to follow the stars to the Far Shores now. If they could not, then they must live on through their children, which was not the same as before. Sep, however, needed more punishment, and so Tulpapa squashed the snake with a big stick. The hunger fell out of Sep's dead mouth, and was the only thing left of the second serpent. While the rest of the new world was allowed to strive back to godhood, Sep could only slink around in a dead skin, or swim about in the sky, a hungry void that jealously tried to eat the stars. Yet more parallels can be seen here between the Yokudan creation myth and those of other races, which is fascinating when you consider that they existed for much of history on a distant western continent away from Tamriel. Sep tricking the spirits into weakening themselves is just like Lorcan and the Aedra. Pleading with Tulpapa to save them is the same as Auriel and the Aedra pleading with Anwiel, the soul of Anu, to take them back. And Sep suffers the same fate as Lorcan. The big stick that squashed him is like the adamantine tower upon which the convention was held, and Sep's hunger continued to long for sustenance, just as Lorcan's heart continued to beat within the bowels of Red Mountain. As the deceived spirits continued to exist on Sep's creation, the world of dead skin, they degenerated. They gradually changed from immortal beings to finite ones. They became the mortal races of Nirn. This is the creation story of the Redguards, and if we look once again to the annotated Annuad, which posits an explanation for the origin of all human and elven races, then we can learn what happened to these weakened spirits. The old Elnathay, the spirits who would become the ancestors to elves, remained on Tamriel, while the wandering Elnathay, the spirits who would be the ancestors to the men, were scattered around the new world. Some inhabited Atmora in the distant icy north. Others resided in the east, in mysterious Akavir, and the last group found themselves in the west, in Yokuda. These western wanderers would soon become the Yokudans, and it would be some time before they returned to the land of Old El Nefei, to Tamriel. Practically all of what we know about the Yokudans, and subsequently the Redguards, has been revealed to us since their migration. Traditions, culture, architecture, and dress give us Tamrielites an idea of what life was like on Yokuda. But no one can say with certainty, short of communing with the spirits of the first Tamrielic settlers, what Yokuda and the history of its people was truly like. The one exception may be Vivek, but it's hard to take anything the poet-god of the Dunma says as gospel. In his 36 lessons, Vivek tells the story of his journey across Nirn to train the Hortator in the martial arts of the foreign lands. They visited Atmora and Akavir, and then they came to the west where the black men dwelt. For a year they studied under their sword saints, and then for another, Vivek taught them the virtue of the little reward. Vivek chose a king for a wife, and made another race of monsters which ended up destroying the West completely. Perhaps this sermon contains some truth. Perhaps it's all true, or it could just be all fiction. Whatever the case, we'll talk about the destruction of Yokuda soon, as it shaped the future of the Yokudan people drastically. Before it sank into the sea, Yokuda was an arid array of deserts, rocky coastlines, and barren hills. The Yokudans were an innately hardened race. In comparison, Hammerfell was optimally hospitable. There is a theory that suggests that Yokuda was once a part of the same landmass as Tamriel, but was ripped free during the El Nefei Wars of the Dawn. Of course, there's little evidence to support any theories regarding ancient history, but it would explain why Yokuda seemed to have a population of elves. Remember, the Anuad claims that the elves remained on Tamriel. Anyway, much of Yokuda's history would involve conflicts between the Yokudans and the left-handed elves. The earliest known ruling body of the Yokudans was named the Natatambu, and it was a council composed of all the kings of the various Yokudan nations. Together they birthed magnificent advances in metallurgy, agriculture, and shipbuilding unknown even in modern times. Much of the Natatambu government structure existed in the early days of Yokudan Hammerfell, though no doubt a great deal of their former wisdom sank with the continent. During the Malefic times, the Natatambu kings waged a 1,000-year war with the left-handed elves, and only emerged victorious thanks to the aid from two of their deities, Leki and Diagna. The Council of Kings seemed to be an effective model of governance, but by the beginning of the First Era, Yokuda had transformed into a great empire, ruled by a single emperor. In First Era 376, the Yokudans inevitably decided this was not a good system, and abolished the sovereignty of a single monarch. Unfortunately, the unity that the Yokudans had had during the 1,000-year war was not to be again, as division of power was never properly allocated. Provincial lords, warrior monks, and even brigands all warred over land and power, and Yokuda was torn apart by civil war. Warlords were born of this bloody saga, and many more were killed. Those who achieved victory became known as Yokida, and built huge stone castles on their acquired lands, and cities soon sprung up around these fortresses. Before the constant warring, the Yokudans had prided themselves on being cultured, driven by intellectual pursuits. Had they existed around other cultures, they would have been considered artistic visionaries. The Yokudans could wield a sword, but that was rarely an individual's primary skill. First and foremost, they were artisans, poets, mystics, and scholars. They were philosophers. But the bloodshed had made barbarians of this refined society. The Yokudans needed a new outlet for their creativity and ingenuity, one that coincided with military strength. And that is how sword singing came to be, a brilliant and powerful art that would bring both enlightenment and devastation to the Yokudan people. The way of the sword philosophy was the whetstone that sharpened the martial art and gave it its edge. With it, singers could channel pure inspiration and belief into a magic sword, which may one day be forged from the wielder's very soul. It was a remarkable arcane art, the kind of magic modern scholars could only dream of comprehending. Sword singing, despite the focus on combat, was a holistic endeavour that incorporated the artistic, spiritual, and religious aspects of Yokudan culture, and by manifesting as a martial art, it not only guaranteed the survival of the arts, it allowed them to flourish anew. Countless Yokudans joined the order, and temples were built across the land in honour of the gods of war, who we'll talk about in more detail soon. These temples also served as training halls for initiates, and were named Halls of the Virtues of War. Male initiates were called brothers of the blade, while females were sisters of the spirit sword. The path to mastery likely evolved over time, but in Hammerfell it involved following the lead of the greatest swordslinger to ever live, Frandar Hunding, on a trek through the wilderness aptly named the Walkabout. The gods of the Yokudan pantheon also went on a walkabout of their own, when they learned to survive the ending of Satakarl's cycle. Elite among the swordsingers were the Ansai, the Saints of the Sword. These decorated members could conjure a phenomenally powerful spirit sword called a Shihai. Mastery of the martial arts was not enough to harness the Shihai. It also took a great deal of psychological training and meditation. Some sword singers, despite their physical talents, were never able to make this step from singer to saint. As you could imagine, the popularity and power of this new martial art would change the course of Yokudan history. By First Era 609, Yokuda was once again ruled by a lone ruler. His name was Mansell Cessnit, and he was the Elden Yokida, the military dictator. He was a brilliant military mind, and after many battles, almost succeeded in unifying the whole of Yokuda into one empire. 8 years into his reign, he was assassinated, and Randik Torn, who is described as being a commoner, assumed Mansell's mantle. Remarkably, Torn ruled for 120 years, which makes me wonder just how much more advanced the Yokudans were than the Redguards. When Torn died in First Era 737, a civil war broke out, and the victor, Emperor Hera, took the opposite approach to governance. Torn had emphasized the importance of the sword singers to keeping the peace, giving them the exclusive ability to wear swords. Hera, on the other hand, set about exterminating the sword singers, for they posed a threat to his personal military. With their numbers dwindling, the singers knew they needed to galvanize and fight for their survival. Subsequently, the War of the Singers occurred. During the course of the civil wars, Frandar Hunding was a youth, and he was making a name for himself as a sword singer. By the time of the war, he was 30, a master Ansai, and had retreated to the mountains to write his Book of Circles. His son Divad had been a prominent proponent in the resistance against Hera. Hera's militia had created a monster in Divad. They had sent 100 soldiers to arrest him. Knowing the threat he posed, only one of the soldiers struck Divad's mother, Frandar's wife, killing her in the process. At that moment, the Shihai roused within Divad. He turned his shackles into swords and cut down 4 soldiers before escaping. Frandar had hoped to find an end to the bloodshed through diplomacy, but Divad convinced him that this was not possible. Together they formed the Army of the Circle, and Frandar bestowed the singers with his pondered philosophies, as well as his martial strategies. They learned Hunding's way, and the future of the sword singers was changed forever. The Army of the Circle was outnumbered 30-1, yet they achieved a Pyrrhic victory at the foot of Mount Hatu. Gallantry aside, the people of Yokuda were sick of bloodshed, and Frandar was not welcomed as a hero. This is when Frandar took his army across the eastern seas, in search of a new home. This was the first wave of 4 migrations we know as the Warrior Wave, the Regarda. Hunding's flotilla of ships, containing the roughly 20,000 surviving singers of the Circle Army, landed on the shores of Hammerfell in First Era 780. They were met with immediate resistance from the native giant goblins. Frandar was not willing to coexist with these beasts, and the singers warred with the goblins of the Flinttooth tribe. The goblins had no hope of prevailing against the Yokudans, who were arguably the greatest warriors in existence at the time. This does not mean the goblins were helpless though. Their size and brutality made them a tough foe for even the singers, and Frandar was slain in their attempts to conquer the Alakir. His legacy would live on through his teachings, and through his book, and his son Divad led the first wave of Yokudans to eventual victory. The Yokudans were not alone in Hammerfell by any means, but the Nedic and Elven settlers of pre-Yokudan Hammerfell, or Vollenfell as it was currently known, would gradually lose their grasp on the land as more waves of warriors hit the western shores. 3 more Regarda warrior waves followed, only these Yokudans came as refugees. Around First Era 792, 12 years after Frandar Hunding led the first wave to Vollenfell, news of a devastating calamity came from the west. The entire continent had sank into the sea. The cause of such grand-scale destruction was unknown. Surely these 3 following warrior waves must have known something, but if they did, the truth has been obscured by the passage of time. Some say it was a natural disaster, completely unavoidable by design. Others suggest that the sword singers, particularly the sect called the Hera Dirge, who focused on stone magic and were defeated in a civil war in the same year, unleashed their forbidden sorceries on the land in an act of revenge. And then, of course, there's the largely baseless claim of Vivek, who insists he gave birth to the race of monsters responsible for the continent's doom. There is one final ludicrous explanation for the destruction, from an out-of-law source written by the one and only eccentric lawmaster Michael Kirkbride. The text describes a meeting between Vivek and the legendary Redguard warrior Cyrus the Restless. In the meeting, Cyrus threatens Vivek with the Pankratos sword. Vivek responded by saying, "You would not. You would destroy the home of your ancestors even more, and in the fashion that they had done, which is now forbidden in your hands. Cut the Atomos and you die too." That's right, it is theorized that the Pankratos sword was a sword-singing technique that could split atoms and cause nuclear destruction. You'd have to be a little mad to believe this explanation, even if the conversation between Vivek and Cyrus was considered canon. But there's always a dash of madness in every piece of Elder Scrolls lore. This particular cause would certainly explain why the Yokudans who escaped were so reticent and willing to die without revealing what they knew about their former home. They may not have wanted this power in other people's hands. But whatever the truth may be, Yokuda was gone, and the Yokudans who arrived in the 4 warrior waves would become the Redguards of Hammerfell we know today. The Tava worshippers came in the second wave. These Yokudans first landed on the Isle of Herne, before completing the voyage to the mainland in First Era 808. This wave included the remains of the Natatambu ruling class. The third wave, led by Grandi Yagub, sailed into the Iliac Bay and established the city of Sentinel on Hammerfell's north coast. The fourth wave, led by the self-styled Emperor Tarish Z, were called the Anko Ra, and they cut their way across the mainland in search of a new home. They did not stop until they reached the northeastern region of Craglorn. The 4 migrations each endeavoured to rid their new homeland of native blights, be they beast or need or elf. The Redguards were especially brutal in their treatment of the Mer, as they'd had a long and bloody history dealing with the left-handed elves in Yokuda. To the modern day, Redguards are averse to trusting elves, and the sight of a pointed ear is enough to boil the blood of their more aggressive warriors. The Elysians and Nords had raided the desolate expanses of Hammerfell for a long time prior to the arrival of the Yokudans, but those days were coming to an end, as the Redguard settlers had established a strong presence all over the province. After dealing with the orcs, goblins, men and elves of Hammerfell, the new inhabitants were pleased to discover an abundance of beautiful citadels waiting for them. The Dwemer of the Rorken clan had built many glorious cities, only to disappear from the face of the planet 100 years before Redguards arrived. As such, the Redguards established many of their new cities around these sites. I talked about the Yokudans being a cultured race, who value artistic and scholastic pursuits, but you can understand why the prosperous races of Tamriel at the time would view the Redguards as savages. They landed on Hammerfell's shores and meticulously slaughtered every living thing that dared to own territory in the province. You can justify their martial nature by saying it's a form of creative expression, but I for one would not care about the distinction between a steel sword and a spirit sword when a barbaric foreigner is trying to stick it through my chest. After arriving in Hammerfell, Frandar Hunding's Book of Circles became the fundamental text for sword singers, and even after sword singer numbers dwindled, his philosophies remained integral to Redguard culture. Before we delve into the history of the Redguards in their new homeland, let's talk about their society. From religion to culture to art and architecture, there is plenty of inspiration taken from Yokuda, but simultaneously, much has changed. Firstly, one thing that hasn't changed is Redguard physiology. The dry deserts, barren badlands and rugged mountains of Hammerfell share a lot of similarities with the terrain of Yokuda. If anything, Hammerfell is more hospitable. Thousands of years in these harsh conditions has forged a race of tall, sinewy and dark-skinned men. Their skin tone is perfectly suited to surviving in the heat, and the Redguards are, on average, stronger and quicker than the other races. Of course, the fact that they are typically fitter than their counterparts is heavily influenced by their culture, which emphasizes warrior virtues. Even intellectual and noble-born Redguards are expected to be built like warriors, and should be formidable fighters. This is a boon of the intermingling of art and war. If you look at the Imperials in comparison, scholars aren't as likely to wield swords, merchants trade in coin, not in blows, and the nobility tend to indulge in the finer things, wearing gold-trimmed cloth, not chainmail. What the Redguards inherited from old Yokuda allowed them to prosper where other races had merely hoped to survive. The Yokudans had learned intricate agricultural practices in order to cultivate crops in Yokuda's lifeless soil. They carried these practices with them to Hammerfell, as well as their skills for seafaring and navigation. They even appear to have some understanding of astronomy. Old sand maps have been uncovered which show the role of the constellations in travel. Grandi Yagub of the Third Warrior Wave had used the sign of the steed to find his way to Hammerfell. The way of the sword was adopted by warriors, and this was the only form of magic embraced by the Redguards. As with most cultures, Redguard society was built around religion. The gods served as the foundation for morals, values and traditions that would persist regardless of where the Redguards lived. As we can see through the Tava worshippers of the Second Wave, the gods crossed the Elferic Ocean with the Yokudans. We covered the fundamentals of Redguard religion when discussing their creation story, but there are many gods still to talk about. The geographical distance between the Redguards and the other known races has led them to worship a very unique pantheon. Some are clear analogues of familiar deities, but others are completely independent. We know Satakal the World-Skin, but then we have Ruptga or Tulpapa, fathered many of the gods, and led the walkabout which permitted the spirits to endure Satakal's self-consumption. Tuwaka is the Yokudan equivalent to Arke. He's the god of souls in the afterlife. Hoon Ding is the make-way god, the spirit of triumph over infidels. He appears in some form or another when the Redguards need guidance. Diagna, the god of the sideways blade, is an avatar of Hoon Ding. He appeared to the Yokudans to aid them in their millennia-long conflict with the left-handed elves. Tava is the Yokudan equivalent to Kinnereth. Though just like with Tuwaka and Arke, never say to a Redguard that they're the same. Traditional Redguards are not fond of these comparisons. Tava is a bird god, and she is the spirit of the air and sun. Leki is the divine daughter of Tulpapa, and she is the saint of the spirit sword. Her sphere is aberrant swordsmanship, and she is responsible for bestowing the Redguards with their complex martial arts and techniques. Sep is the Yokudan name for Lorcan, and his role is similar to Lorcan's in the Tale of the World-Skin. Maluk, the Horde King, the enemy of the Yokudans and the god of goblins, is of course the Redguard version of Malakath. Morwa, the Yokudan fertility goddess, is the favourite among Tulpapa's wives, and plays the same role as Mara of the Divines. Next we have Onsi the Bone Shaver, the patron of the Regada warrior waves. He's mentioned several times in Hunding's Book of Circles, and he is responsible for giving the Yokudans the gift of forging weapons. Finally there's Zet, the god of agriculture and analogue to the god Zenithar. One of the greatest threats to the Redguards after settling in Hammerfell, and especially the Alakir, was necromancy. In the Redguard religion, no mortal should ever meddle with the undead. To interfere with Tuwaka's work is considered sacrilege. The Ansai offered a solution to the rise of necromancy. Some of their most renowned warriors created Ansai wards. By sacrificing themselves, they stored their souls in their weapons, and these relics, which appear as huge scimitars, encrusted with gems and wrought in gold, protect the dead of the many tombs and mausoleums across the Alakir. No Redguard should be deprived of their journey to the far shores. Here the spirits await the day that Sakatal eats himself and the world begins anew. With the exception of the Ansai Sword Saints, saints in the traditional religious sense don't really exist in Redguard society. However, Frandar Hunding is as close to a religious saint as you'll find. Every household in Hammerfell has an alcove which holds a copy of the Book of Circles. Redguard Style is also quite distinct from the other races inhabiting Tamriel. Dwelling in the desert guarantees a few things. Light, full-body garments are essential. The way the desert winds curve and crease their flowing fabrics inspires their design. Their robes and armour are often accented by flared curves at joints and on headgear. Even their swords tend to be curved. Architecture is a stark contrast, as their buildings are constructed to stand firm against the elements, not move with them. Thick walls of heavy stone protect the interior from the heat and the sandstorms during the day, while also providing insulation against the chill of the night. These stone structures are topped with domes of gold and brass which gleam in the summer sun. They make for a glorious spectacle to travellers and locals alike. Of course, these buildings are erected to endure, and haven't budged an inch since the stones were first placed. Tents are used just as often, but for the opposite effect. They're quick and easy to set up, and they're mobile. They break the wind and provide shade in the heart of the desert. For much of history, the many Yokudan empires, kingdoms, clans, and orders have shared the same culture. But after the migration to Hammerfell, a rift was driven between the Redguards who wished to embrace the new, and those who held on tightly to the past. The fracturing resulted in the founding of two factions, the Crowns and the Forebears. The Crowns descended from the line of Natatambu kings. They revere Yokudan tradition and dislike foreigners. And of course, by foreigners, I mean the people who inhabited Tamriel prior to their arrival. The Forebears descended from the Yokudans, who were more aggressive in conquering territory in those early days. In taking more land, they were exposed to many Tamrielic cultures and civilizations. These Redguards tend to reside further inland, when neighbouring societies are more likely to mesh with them. Therefore, these Redguards were naturally more cosmopolitan. They encountered Nedic humans, as well as the Bretons and Imperials who followed, and saw the benefits of adopting some of their better ideas. They were not traitors to the old ways, but wanted to take a modern approach approach to establishing society, keeping what worked from the Yokudan way, while implementing elements from their neighbours. The Bretons had built a successful society in High Rock largely thanks to the sophistication of the Doreni elves. The Elysians of Sirad had a similar rise to prominence, only it came on the back of a brutal transfer of power. The Bretons merged the old ways of the Doreni with their new commerce and liberty-focused values, and as a result, High Rock thrived. The Elysians despised their Aelid oppressors, but there was no denying how advanced the Heartland elves were. The Elysian Empire kept some of the Aelid gods, and even allowed some compliant Aelid kings to retain their power for a time. In short, there was a whole new continent to learn about. Mistakes and achievements, both could be useful to making Hammerfell successful, but the Crowns were not interested in the Forebears' contemporary progressive attitudes. It's quite easy to distinguish between Redguards loyal to one of these factions. The Forebears have adopted elements of Imperial and Breton dress, naming conventions, and even architectural style. They're also much more open to the notion that their gods are analogous to the gods of the other men and elves. They tend to live in populated cities, particularly coastal cities where interprovincial trade is abundant. The crowds wear traditional clothing, use Yokudan naming conventions, and their buildings look as they had across the ocean. The Crowns tend to live in rural settlements, and in the secluded southern or inland cities. The rift between Crown and Forebear has played a crucial role in Redguard history on Tamriel, but let's talk history from where we left off, after they settled in Hammerfell. In First Era 980, the Redguard Order of Diagna took part in the Siege of Orsinium. Aside from achieving victory, their involvement opened the door to establishing relationships with the neighbouring civilizations. The Order saw the Breton kingdom of Daggerfall in action, and were impressed by their martial prowess. Trade with High Rock subsequently followed, and the Redguards even went so far as to abandon the Yoku language in the interest of stabilising foreign trade. The Second Empire, under the leadership of Emperor Riemann Cyrodiil, brought Hammerfell under their control. This obviously wouldn't have gone down well with the Redguards, who would have had trouble accepting that any other race could match their might. The Redguards could no longer call themselves kings, and the two parties, Crowns and Forebears, were formed. The Redguards also joined the Daggerfall Covenant of Second Era 582, though there was undoubtedly a great deal of distrust in the alliance, and I'm sure many Redguards were hesitant to fight alongside orcs. The Imperial Interregnum lasted some time, and eventually, the two branches of government established in response to Riemann Cyrodiil's supreme rule broke down. The Natutambu kings quickly restored their traditional monarchy, and the new High King moved from Hagath, where they had first landed all those centuries ago, to the prosperous city of Sentinel. Sentinel had long been a Forebear holding, and of course, the High King was a monarch elected by the Crowns. The factions fought over the city, which was known as the Jewel of the Alakir, but the bloody conflict would soon be redundant, as Tiber Septim ended the Interregnum in Second Era 854, and capitalised on the civil war to absorb Hammerfell into the Septim Empire. A decade after Septim came to power, in 864, a revolt erupted on Stros Makai. The Redguards succeeded in causing enough trouble for the Empire to warrant significant concessions of power. The Third Era saw the Redguards participate in a few wars. The first was the War of Bethany in Third Era 403. In this conflict, the former allies Daggerfall and Sentinel fought over the Isle of Bethany. Daggerfall won this war. The Miracle of Peace saw the Kingdom of Sentinel expand its borders drastically, and it now encompasses all of northern Hammerfell. 7 years before the War of Bethany, the Redguards had fought the Nords of Skyrim in the War of the Bender Mark. This war went in favour of the Nords, who annexed great swaths of eastern Hammerfell and High Rock. Towards the end of the Third Era, the Redguards worked on recovering these lost lands. From 4th Era 171 to 175, the Redguards had played a major role in the Great War between the Empire and the Aldmeri Dominion. The feats of General Decianus and the forces of Hammerfell were crucial in retaking the Imperial city, and simultaneously, the Redguards had been working on stifling the advance of Dominion forces in their domain, all the while dealing with civil infighting between the ever-contentious Crowns and Forebears. When the White Gold Concordat was signed, the Redguards finally left the Empire, as they were unwilling to cede large chunks of southern Hammerfell to the Elves. They left the Empire, and independently put up a fierce resistance to the Dominion. They were so successful that the High Elves had no choice but to write up the Second Treaty of Stros Makai, an agreement that favoured the Redguards. Unlike the Imperials with their White Gold Concordat, the Redguards were not humiliated, and the Aldmeri Dominion was forced to withdraw completely from Hammerfell. Much has changed since the Yokudans landed on the shores of Hammerfell and became the Redguards. Many wars were won and lost. Political and social rifts pitted brothers against one another. Some Redguards maintain tradition, others embrace change. But one thing that remains consistent is that, whether they call themselves Crown or Forebear, the Redguards are gifted warriors and intellectuals, and they will not bow before any foreign threat, be they man, elf or beast. The art of sword singing, as well as much of what came from Yokuda, has seemed to fade into obscurity, but it may just return when the Redguards need it most. And there you have it, guys, the complete guide to the Redguards. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks so much for watching. My name is Drew, this has been FudgeMuppet, and I'll see you in the next one.